Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Behind the Beacon podcast. I'm your host, SETH ORENSKY. I hope you enjoyed the first episode, and I'm really excited for today's episode and some of the interviews I'm planning on doing in the upcoming weeks. Before we get to our first interview, I want to remind all of our student athletes that today, September 15th, is the ad drop deadline for classes during fall semester. If you have any questions, please contact Mary Beth Manine. If you weren't able to make it live, you can check out last week's State of the Beacons webinar on our UMass Beacons YouTube page. Finally, the expanded True Beacons program begins next week. The junior class session will be on Monday, September 21st. The seniors are on Tuesday, September 22nd. The freshmen are on Wednesday, September 23rd. And the sophomores are on Thursday, September 24th. All sessions will begin at 7 p.m. Emails with more information about the sessions and the Zoom links will go out this week. For more information, check out the True Beacons page on beaconsathletics.com. Our first guest this week is Interim Director of Athletics, Darlene Gordon. Darlene took over as the Interim Director of Athletics earlier this year after serving as Special Assistant to Vice Chancellor Charlie Titus for over a year. Previously to UMass Boston, she worked at the Patriot League, the Mid-American Conference, and the National Association of College Directors of Athletics. This is a chance to get to know Darlene better and learn about her athletics background and her vision for the athletics department. We're joined by Interim Director of Athletics, Darlene Gordon. Darlene, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you. Darlene, this week's episode is a chance for the UMass Boston community to get to know you a little bit. Where are you from originally, and what was your athletics background growing up?
I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. I come from a pretty athletic family, although I didn't inherit any of those genes whatsoever. I played high school basketball, and I ran middle school track. I was not that good in either one of those sports. Growing up, my mom also had me playing golf. She did that for myself and my sister. Again, I didn't get any of those genes. My sister ended up with a golf scholarship to go to college. I did not. So in terms of just athletic background, the physical pieces, not so great. My uncle, though, was a recreation director for the Salvation Army. And so that's kind of where I got my administrative piece regarding athletics, where I got a chance to keep the books for the basketball league that he ran. I worked with the referees in terms of when it was time to get them into the gym and out of the gym and all that kind of stuff. So I did those kinds of things growing up.
You talked about your family being athletic. One thing you haven't mentioned is your dad, who played a sport I'd never heard of until 5 minutes ago, beep ball. Can you explain a little bit about your dad and the sport that he was able to play despite his disability?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for reminding me to bring that up. Beep ball is a sport that is played by people who are visually impaired. So my father is totally blind, and he's played this sport, maybe a good 10 years, maybe he's played this sport. And the sport itself is a variation of the sport of baseball. The only person on the team that is sighted is the pitcher. Everything else has a sound to it that helps the players locate either the ball or the base. Really cool sport, and it's played all over the country, actually. And they have tournaments all over the country and globally. My father has played beep ball in Finland, in Vancouver, California, Illinois, all over the place. He's also part of a bowling team as well that plays locally in the Cleveland area, but they also have tournaments nationally as well. And so he travels for those as well. So really cool sport. He's the guy that basically lets me know that you can do anything. Like I said, he's a sportsman through and through. Beep ball, bowling, fishing, all of that.
That's awesome. Darlene, after you graduated from Eastern Michigan University, you created and were the owner and president of KGG Consulting in Cleveland. You worked there for just over a decade, and you worked with a lot of athletic groups, the Cleveland Browns, the National Basketball Players Association, even Continental Hotels, which certainly has tie-ins to athletics. How did that owning and running your own company prepare you for a leadership role? And also, did that kind of push you to maybe get into athletics on a full-time basis?
Actually, when I started that company, it was primarily to deal with people with disabilities. And so it grew into something that I became really good at, and it ended up where I was able to talk with people who were in the sports industry that needed some similar types of skills to help some of their players. So it, like I said, initially started out where I was helping visually and physically impaired individuals find employment. Nationally, the unemployment rate around people with disabilities is around 60%, which is quadruple the national average for those who don't have disabilities. So my company was to help those folks try to find employment and training opportunities. Because of the skill that you have to have in terms of teaching people how to find employment, oddly enough, it is something that professional athletes also need when they're transitioning out of professional sports. So I helped with the Players Association, the NBA Players Association, worked with some of their players when they were on the downside of their career to create internships for them so that they can figure out what they want to do after playing basketball. And on the flip side of it, for the NFL, I actually did some things for the Cleveland Browns. And it was about helping their rookies make the transition into sports. And some of those guys, oddly enough, because of the types of contracts they would sign and the lack of financial responsibility some of them had, would end up needing jobs during the summer. And so that was my role when I worked with the Cleveland Browns, is to help some of those players find employment until training camp got back into session.
Did working with those groups, having an athletics background growing up, maybe change your focus on what you wanted to do going forward? Because it seems like ever since you left KGG, the focus has been on building a role in athletics, specifically a leadership role in athletics.
Oddly enough, I've always loved athletics, even growing up and even once I was in college, but it was not a popular major, and it wasn't a major that I even thought I had an option to take a look at in terms of sports management, sports administration. The only people I really thought about actually working in sports were coaches and players. And of course, athletic trainers, and that was it. But as you know, the industry itself is much bigger than just coaches and players and athletic trainers. And so getting a chance to kind of see internally about some of the things that actually happen within the sports industry said to me, hey, you can actually still do this. You can work in this industry and use the administrative skills that you have to be a part of it.
Looking at your resume over the past 15 years, you've done it all. You've worked at the national level, you've worked at several conferences, and you've worked at schools. How did each of those levels, maybe not each of those stops, but each of those levels kind of shape who you are as a leader, shape kind of what you viewed as important in terms of being a leader in an athletics department or in an athletics organization?
Well, whenever you're sitting in the leadership chair, you're supposed to be thinking globally, which is what working in a conference office or in an association requires that you do. You have to consider, in the conference office environment, you have to consider all 10 of your members, or however many members happen to be within your conference. And so you can't focus in on one particular sport or one particular program. You have to do some things that are global. And so when you get a chance to sit in the athletic director's chair, you have to think globally. You have to think about what's the best outcomes for the entire athletic department, not just one particular sport.
Very interesting and great answer. I hadn't thought about it that way. Before you were named interim director of athletics, you spent 18 months working as the special assistant to the vice chancellor. How did those 18 months kind of shape your vision for the department and for the future of the UMass Boston Athletics Department?
Well, first of all, getting a chance to work under Charlie Titus was a true gift, because you get a chance to see, he's someone who, I'm the second person to sit in that chair. He is the one and only person that has sat in this chair, and he had the ability to grow it from a basketball intramurals program all the way to 18 sports, which is a tremendous feat. And getting a chance to pick their brain and see the people that he has selected and why he selected them and what strengths those folks bring to the table was a tremendous learning opportunity for me. I would say it was priceless. And getting that opportunity and then being able to sit in the chair, I think gave me a huge advantage from somebody who potentially would not have known anything about UMass Boston internally of what things would be important. So I'm completely grateful for that opportunity, having the chance to be his special assistant.
What is your vision and goals for the department, both for this year, where obviously there's so many questions because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also going forward for the foreseeable future?
So in some ways, my vision during the pandemic and moving forward is basically the same. My goal is to create a championship environment for the entire division. And so most people think about that in terms of just the games, getting to conference championships, getting a chance to go to NCAA tournaments and hopefully move through the tournament rounds to get a national championship. I absolutely want that. There's no question in my mind. I want that. But I also want a championship environment that touches every segment of our department. So I want us to have championship sports information. I mean, we've got, now I'm being biased at this moment, we've got some folks in our athletic department that do a great job and do some things that are, you know, comparable to some of the stuff that's happening in Division I when it comes to streaming and promotion of our different programs, sports programs, and so on. I think is tremendous. But I need it to be recognized internally and externally, so that people know that when students come and participate in our athletic department, that they're getting the best of everything. The best of everything. Our sports medicine folks, our sports information, academic support, compliance, everything. And if you have that, I think it helps with retention. I believe it helps with recruitment. And even in this crazy environment that we're working in right now, I still believe that's possible to have it. And so right now I'm trying to focus on some of our areas that are outside of the coaching portion to help hopefully form a championship vision and environment for those departments that surround our coaches. And when they return, we're talking about really hitting the floor running in such a positive way. That excites me.
Well, Darlene, thanks so much for providing some information about yourself and about your vision for the department. I'm sure it's definitely going to be great for some of the student athletes, the families, and the alums to get to know you better. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us on the podcast.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Everybody enjoy and have a wonderful weekend.
That was my interview with Interim Director of Athletics, Darlene Gordon. Darlene and the entire athletic staff has been working hard behind the scenes throughout the COVID-19 pandemic to get UMass Boston athletes and staff back on campus and ready to compete as soon as possible. Before we get to our next interview, I'd like to dig a little deeper on one of the On This Date posts from this past week. On September 14, 2005, women's soccer coach Amy Zombeck earned her first career head coaching win with a 6-0 victory over Mitchell College. After earning a 2-2 overtime tie against Eastern Nazarene College in her coaching debut, Zombeck led the Beacons to a 6-0 win in the fourth game of the season. The Beacons recorded a then-program record 60 shots in the win over the Mariners and outshot Mitchell 60-0. Their shot margin of 60 shots is tied for the program record as the 2009 women's soccer team outshot Wheelock College 61-1 in a 9-0 victory. I'll have more on this game and the women's soccer program next week when Amy Zombeck will be on the show. Now let's turn to our second guest. Ed Perkins has been a member of the UMass Boston community for almost 30 years. The Beacon's longtime athletic trainer and current Assistant Director of Athletics for Sports Performance and Operations started his time with UMass Boston as a student athlete. After graduating in 1991, Perkins took a job as an athletic trainer in 1996 and has been a key part of student athletes' time in the department for the past 24 years. Ed talks about his circuitous route to UMass Boston, why he returned, and just how far the department has come during his time as a Beacon. Ed, you were a local kid, but you didn't start your collegiate career or your football career at UMass Boston. What path did you take, and why did UMass Boston feel like a better fit when you ended back in Boston after your freshman year?
I grew up in the city, and I played high school football at Boston Latin School for Coach Costello, who was, like a lot of high school football players, like a dad to me, like a father figure. And so part of the reason I loved football was because I loved playing for Coach Costello. And every chance he could get to promote, his seniors, he would. And so we had a really good player on our team, and a lot of Division I schools were interested in him. And when anybody would come to visit him, Coach Costello would put a few of us in the room. And so UNH, University of New Hampshire, took an interest in me just, through our meeting and then subsequent films. And then recruited me as a recruited walk-on. And so I ended up at UNH kind of blindly. I didn't have a lot of direction out of high school in terms of where I wanted to go to college or what I wanted to go to college for. And so it was a drastic change from high school football to Division I football. And it was something that I wasn't ready for, both academically and in terms of the commitment on the athletic side for just an 18-year-old kid. So I decided after my freshman year that I wasn't going to return. And my mom was adamant about, going to school. And because I grew up in Dorchester, and to us, UMass Boston, was something that we were really proud of. And so I enrolled in UMass Boston late that summer, early fall. And somehow it kind of got to Coach Kent, who was the club football coach at the time, that this kid who was up at UNH is now at UMass Boston. So he kind of pursued me and wanted me to play. And so I did. I played a year for Coach Kent. It was a club program. It was either the initial year or second year of club football at UMass Boston. And Coach Kent was a great guy. He was a lot like my high school coach. And so for me, UMass Boston felt like a better fit just because I was familiar with UMass Boston. It was a really welcoming environment.
What was playing on the club team like?
For me, being really young, 18, 19 years old, I was playing with guys in their mid-20s, guys who had played, kind of park league, and who were much older, physically much bigger than me. And so it was different. Back then it was really different. He was building something. So obviously he had a goal in mind. But those first few initial teams, I think the commitment level was really kind of all over the board. So for some of us, the younger kids, the commitment level felt more like high school, where, you practice every day, you prepared for Saturday. And then for some of the older guys who had different obligations, jobs, families, the commitment level was very different. So they would show up on game day with their equipment in the back of their trunk and suit up and play. And so it was different. It was serious, but not too serious. But Coach Kent was definitely going in a direction to build it towards a varsity program. And then for me, in terms of athletics and academics, I was just in a confused spot in terms of my academics at the time. And so seeing the commitment level on the club team being kind of all over the place, and, my commitment with school kind of being a little kind of all over the place, some of those first few semesters for me ended up being kind of part-time semesters with kind of varying commitments to work. And we see that even today with some of our students.
Ed, it took until your fourth year in college for you to decide on an academic path, and that's really in part defined who you are for the past 30 years. It gave you a career path. It's brought you back to UMass Boston, and you've certainly made a huge impact on the athletics department. How big was it to kind of find that right avenue for you? A lot of times we talk about trying to find it early on, what you want to do, but sometimes that's not the case for everyone.
Right. And so I think that's what's really neat about UMass Boston is that, it allows you to kind of find yourself. If I was at a small private school with very rigid course loads, I might just get frustrated and leave. Versus UMass Boston, I was allowed, some flexibility and some freedom to just kind of float for a little while. My mom was adamant about me staying in school, and so, the first 3 years were, a lot of liberal arts undeclared courses, a lot of psychology and sociology courses. I tended to have had a lot of psychology courses on my curriculum. I remember my fourth year, my mom being like, hey, at some point you got to declare a major. And so my older sister was really helpful in that she kind of knew the ins and outs of the university in terms of what they had to offer. She at the time was a social psychology major, and she's actually one of the few people who have that degree from UMass. And she said to me, they have a physical education department. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I don't know if I want to teach. And she's like, they have other majors besides teaching. And so she kind of walked me over there one day. And I noticed that they had, sports medicine / athletic training. And I looked at the curriculum and I looked how it was laid out. And some of the coursework intrigued me: anatomy and physiology, exercise physiology. And so I enrolled in the athletic training. And I was really fortunate in terms of, back then, the athletic training program was an internship program. As students, we were required to do 1,500 hours in the athletic training room down in athletics. And so Brian Fitzgerald was the head trainer. Larry Venice was the assistant trainer. And so these two men really influenced me early on, and are to this day mentors of mine. And so they really kind of helped me early on in terms of trying to find myself professionally.
You graduated from UMass Boston in 1991, and 5 years later came back to UMass Boston after stops with the Patriots, Temple University, MIT, and Bridgewater State. Why did you come back to UMass Boston? What kind of attracted you to take on that role that some of your mentors had been in shortly before?
And I think it was when I was at MIT that, I really thought hard about where I wanted to be in the profession. And, in terms of the Division III, the professional, Division I, like, Division III just felt right for me. It felt the most comfortable. So I really wanted to try to stay in Division III. An opportunity came up at Bridgewater State. I moved down to Bridgewater State. I was only down at Bridgewater a year when Brian Fitzgerald resigned from UMass Boston, and Mary Barrett, who was the associate athletic director at the time, knew me, liked me. She called me and needed to hire somebody quickly and wanted to bring me in. And so I ended up back at UMass Boston just 5 years after I had left. But it was really an awesome feeling at the time, just because it was a school I've always been really fond of, and I was always fond of Mary, and she was always fond of me, and so it just felt right. And so yeah, I've been there now 24 years.
You've been with the department for 24 years, and we're also a student for 4 years previous to that. So 30 years of experience going back to the mid-'80s. What are you most proud of when you look at the evolution of the athletics department during your time as a Beacon?
Oh gosh. And I'm gonna forget half the kids I want to mention. I think it's just some of the athletes that I've really had the pleasure of working with, and some of like the really great athletes. Some of my favorites being Sam Cristoforo, Krista Layden, Taylor Andrews. On the hockey side, God, there's so many hockey kids. I'm gonna forget most of them, but I had an incredible experience being able to work with a Colin Larkin. But even before Colin, like some of the early kids who played for Coach Belisle, Steve Eberly is such a great kid. Even before then, I remember when I was a student trainer for Brian Fitzgerald, Noel Cotterell, who was our soccer coach. God, he had an amazing, amazing team. Charlie Cascanides and Harold Jean-Baptiste. Phenomenal soccer players, just phenomenal soccer players. So there's just been so many great athletes. I think that's what I remember most. I think, the recent success that we've had, Coach Eigebrod has had a tremendous amount of success. And I think I recently said to somebody, he's done more with less than any Division III baseball coach in the country. And I really mean that. When he was still practicing up at Columbia Point, and his kids were crawling through the chain link fence to get to practice, he took one of his early teams to the Division III World Series, which is just amazing. And he has since taken two other teams to the Division III World Series. And just this past, maybe 3 years ago, was maybe literally one game away from being in that final series of 3 games for the national championship. So that was fun. And, and Pete Belisle's run that year that he went to the Frozen Four, and like the talent that was on that team, Matt Lemire, Colin Larkin, Frankie DeAugustine. I mean, it's crazy the talent that we had on that team. So yeah, I have a lot of funny stories, and they're usually around kids. I remember, some times that I spent with Miles Berry in the lacrosse program, and Miles had an incredible run with that lacrosse team. He had like 22-game winning streak, and they did a profile on him, on Nesson, and they just had some really colorful characters on that team. Really funny kids. That Miles and I still talk about to this day, and they were immensely talented. So being the kind of school that we are, early on, athletes would kind of fall in our lap, and they would be really special kids. And so the evolution is that 20 years ago, kids fell in our lap, and now we're their first choice. And so, Colin Larkin, who was the best Division III hockey player in the country, he was recruited by Pete. He came here because of Pete. I mean, this was his first choice. So a lot of the kids, Nicky Herzog, who was the best Division III baseball player in the country, came here out of Long Island. We were his first choice. He came here because of Brendan Eigebrod. Amy's had a ton of kids who have come here through the now South Shore connection, and they came here for her, and it continues to this day, where she has this really strong draw from the South Shore, who kids come here because they want to play for Amy Zombek. So in terms of the athletics, not only have some really positive things occurred in terms of we have all full-time coaches now, but kids come to UMass Boston not only for the education, but because of the athletics. This is where they want to play their sport. So it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
And I want to close with a question about what's going on in the world right now. You've been a trainer or been working in athletic training for 30 years. Have you ever had to face something as difficult in terms of changing your field as the coronavirus? And kind of how will this change the field going forward, or is this more of a temporary change where hopefully once there's a vaccine, you can kind of go back to the normal precautions for keeping student athletes safe?
It's been incredibly stressful on all of us, incredibly stressful. Nobody has ever, I mean, you could compare this to the Spanish flu in the early 1900s. In terms of the NCAA and athletics, nobody has ever experienced a pandemic. So this is challenging for all of us. Coming out of it post-pandemic, I don't believe it'll be just flipping the switch. I think, getting out of this is going to be a combination of vaccine and herd immunity. I think it is going to have a lasting effect on us as a profession and maybe the entire medical community in terms of PPEs, personal protection, protection equipment. Gloves and masks will become more commonplace in terms of how we handle injury and illness, at least for the very short term, but I suspect it will have some carryover effect, especially, with the younger athletic trainers, where this has really made an impact on their thinking, in mine as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us and for giving us insight into your path and also what we might be staring down for the next 6, 12, who knows how many months. It was great having you on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome, Seth. Anytime.
That was my interview with Assistant Director of Athletics for Sports Performance and Operations, Ed Perkins. Ed has put together a terrific staff, including a pair of former Beacons in men's basketball alumni Jeff Ebbs and women's hockey alumni Alexa Capione. That's all for the second ever episode of Behind the Beacons podcast. Make sure to tune in next week when I'll have interviews with women's soccer coach Amy Zombek and men's tennis player Alex Comerchero, who just got home from working at the U.S. Open in New York.